sort of equalizer. We've had 3 East Coast talks this morning. I'm going to try and fit a talk about 3 West Coast projects into one talk. So there we go. Right, so why are we tracking salmon smolts in Scotland here? Generally, one of the core aims the Scottish Government has is to sustainably grow the salmon aquaculture section. But it's also recognised that salmon farms increase the number of sea lice in the environment. This is just an abbreviation of the topic sheet that you can find on the webpage linked. But really, in terms of the projects, what we're looking at is this core part of the programme to examine the outward migration of the salmon smolts using acoustic tracking in key coastal areas and model of the movement patterns based on swimming behaviour in relation to the tides and currents. So I'm going to touch upon some of the preliminary stuff that we've done so far with this. I mean, we've only started doing the acoustic tracking last year, so this is very much early work. So there's 3 separate projects involved. We've got the smolt tracking of fish up in Applecross. We've got the inner Linney salmon and sea trout smolt tracking, and then smolt movements around the Isle of Mull. So the Applecross study was primarily conducted by the team up at Shieldig, which is led by Jason Godfrey. And we're going to use an acoustic array consisting of 4 coastal curtains to aim, the aim of the project is to look at the initial migration and coastal movements of salmon smolts feeding the Applecross River. So here's Applecross here. It's up in the northwest of Scotland, just opposite Skye and Rassay. So the array was constructed like this. It's 20 receivers, 2 in the sea pool, just at the mouth of the river, 9 spread across the bay, and we have 3 smaller curtains spread along the coastline, 1 down the coastline and 2 to the north on the coastline. Yeah, so we had 2 release sites. Because the Applecross River is quite a small river, to maximise our possibility of catching smolts, we deployed a rotary screw trap and a fight net at the 2 white stars. And that's basically the names of the arrays, just for future reference. So 18 out of 20 of the smolts were detected in the sea pool. And only 11 of those were detected leaving the bay on Curtain C. And subsequently, 4 fish were detected on Curtain B, just up the coast. And only 1 was detected up on Curtain A, up to the north coast. We did actually have 19 out of the 20 fish detected on Curtain C, but one of them was deemed to actually be a bird, so it seemed to bypass the sea pool completely. So this is generally the speeds of the smolts as they're moving out into the sea, with very slow speeds in the river and higher movement rates once they get into the coastal area, but still very variable once they're out in the coast. Most of the smolts took a day to travel the 0.3 to 1.3 kilometres from the tagging sites to the sea pool, which suggests some form of handling and tagging induced delay. And some smolts actually spent 1 to 2 days in the sea pool before departing. And movements from the sea pool into the bay were predominantly at night. And as I've said, the speeds in the bay and the coast were highly variable. We actually conducted some range testing with a boat to have a look at the efficacy of the array. And we've actually found that on 3 separate range testing dates, the detection ranges of the receivers were significantly heavily altered by the wind force when you're out at sea doing the tracking. So it suggests that if you do 1 single range test during your study, that it may give you a false impression of how efficient your receivers are. Similarly, we deployed some sentinel tags on Curtain A, and these were slightly skewed, so they were nearer one set of receivers than the other. And what's very apparent is that the efficiency of the receivers are very temporary patchy. You could have very high efficiencies, which then seemingly drop straight off a cliff, and you're getting almost 0% efficiency in some of these receivers. And this seems to be affected by range. So the obvious relationship, the further away you are from a receiver, the less efficient the receiver is. We also had another set of sentinel tags on our AC, which were put in at 1 meter depth and 4 meter depth rather than just 4 meter depth like it was in array A. And again, the same pattern is very apparent. There's no real periods where you're not getting spikes in detection efficiency. We've also just recently started to do some particle tracking with the Scottish shelf model, which is a new tool we've developed where we can start having a look at hydrological models in the sea. This work was done by a postdoc that's just joined our group, James Ownsley, who's more on the mathematical modeling side of things. So it's a simulation of 5,000 passive particles released in Applecross Bay throughout the typical smolt period. These are constrained to the typical water column depths that a smolt would swim in. And the counts are based on hourly observations of individual particle locations. So you can see that there's quite a strong sort of grouping of particles on the northern half of the bay, which ties in with what we've seen from the smolt. And also the particles then are predominantly drawn northward. But when you have a look at this in a national context, these passive particles will continue to just circulate around the coast of Scotland. So it starts to pose some questions about what smolts actually do to avoid just ending up down in England, instead of Norway. So just to summarize Applecross, detections leaving Applecross were predominantly upper half of C. There's high variation in speeds. And subsequent detections in currents A and B were low. If you have a look at the actual particle tracks, you can see that the currents will probably take smolts further away from the coastline than the current actually inhabits. So rather than a mass die-off of smolts, I think it's just the receiver array was small and missed lots of smolts. The thing about the sentinel tag data is these sentinel tags were repeating every 10 minutes. So they might be quite conservative in their efficiency estimates, whereas an ID tag repeats roughly every sort of 30 seconds. So you've got a much higher chance of detecting an ID tag when it moves through a receiver's detection field than a sentinel tag that goes off every 10 minutes. So I guess the take-home from the particle tracking is we need to do further modeling of the biological data and in regard to currents and see what the smolts are actually doing. So this work is work in Inner Loch Linney. This is actually work done by Stuart Middlemiss. I'm just presenting it, so if you can avoid tricky questions, that would be great at the end. And to add a bit more controversy, this is the first comparative information of sea trout post-smolts in Scotland. So it somewhat counters Angus's earlier suggestion. Really, it's to examine how much time sea trout and salmon spend in inshore areas during the initial period of residence in the sea. Very few studies have actually done this. It's actually a lot of information from Norway, but there's little to no information in Scotland. And the information is very, very important for the inshore environment and potential marine planning issues. So this is a sort of general map of the study. The smolts were captured and released on the Lundy Burn in the River Nevis. And there's, I think the black circles are are individual receivers, and the triangles, I think, are, well, the diamonds are arrays of receivers. So it's 15 salmon and 20 sea trout from the Lundy and 35 salmon from the Nevis. And there was no difference between salmon and sea trout when they entered the sea. And they entered on an ebbing tide, primarily. But you can see they tended to enter the saltwater on more or less all of the tidal states, but they were predominantly during an ebb tide. Same with time of day. They tended to enter in at most, well, any hour of the day, but it was heavily weighted towards nighttime. So we've got information provided by the receiver groups, and it's grouped into hourly segments, and the proportion of detected hours in each receiver group for the first 7 days. Sorry, this was then put into a hierarchical cluster analysis to work out if there was patterns of spatial use among tagged sea trout and salmon. So these are the clusters here. You see that there's 2 real clusters, one predominated by salmon and one by trout. And when you actually have a look at where these fish ended up, most of the salmon decided to just then try and quickly leave the upper loch linear out through Corra Narrows, whereas the sea trout tended to hang around the mouth of the lochie and then move into Loch Eel. So there doesn't seem to be any real effort to leave the loch. But it's not 100% differentiation. There is some overlap. So yeah, just a brief summary. No differences in when they leave the river. And once in the sea, the majority of trout stay in the local area. And this basically highlights that offshore planning can have a much higher impact on sea trout than salmon. Right, the third and final study is tracking smolts as they pass the Isle of Mull. So this was really to look at the migration routes that salmon smolts take from 2 different stocks. So here we have the Isle of Mull here and the mouth of Loch Linnhe. So we've got an array that attempts to track fish at least once as they leave this arena. I think there's 34 receivers in total, and the array was deployed in collaboration with S&H for their skate and spur dog tracking. So there's some elements of the array are specifically for tracking skate and spur dog, like the individual receivers, which are the black dots, are put there specifically in deep areas of water with a view to actually detect skate and spur dog more than smolts. So we have our 2 stocks of fish. They enter into the sea roughly around the same area. Hopefully a bit more lively than that. But anyway, so the route choice, they can go up the Sound of Mull or down the Firth of Lorne, and what is influencing that. So here we've got a map of the receiver array. Let's try and work out which one the laser is. Ah, there we go. You see this array here, actually, this isn't fish not getting detected. This is actually damage to the array. You can also see patches here. One of the unfortunate side effects of having an array in this area of the sea is that it's got quite a lot of boat traffic. And when you've got surface floats holding your receivers up, if a big boat comes along and severs the buoy off, then you lose your receiver. So thankfully this year we're actually redeploying some of these receivers on acoustic releases and having them subsurface, so we can hopefully avoid getting our moorings chopped up again. But anyway, the data seems to suggest that the fish that predominantly go up the Sound of Mull are from the lochie, but also lochie fish actually tend to go south as well. There were a couple of fish from the River Awe that that went up northward, but on the whole, they tended to go southward. So there seems to be a kind of split if you're a lochy fish, whereas it's a lot more cut and dry. If you're an aw fish, you go south. So here, this is just the same data recolored. So you can see that actually there's a bit of indecision among smolts that were here. Some that actually ended up going south went up the north route first, and then before going south. And likewise, some that ended up going north went south first. So some behavioral patterns that we can't really answer at the moment, but they're of interest. Some actually ended up in the array, and we don't know whether or not the fish that ended up in the array are either predated or they left the array through some of the gaps that had formed. So this is just generally to show the variation in speeds of fish moving within the array. It's very variable, as you'd expect. And again, this is the same data, but put into the context of ebbing and flooding. And it seems the fish moved fastest when it was an ebbing tide. However, it seems that this is generally quite coarse. I don't think that's really telling us much. So using the same kind of modeling that we have for the particle tracking, we're trying to combine the biological data we have with this current data to see if we can actually get something much more informative out of it. So percentage-wise, it was 52 and 42%, 42.5% of smolts. I don't know how half a smolt gets detected, but anyway. So this shows that we've got reasonably good, as you classically term, survival of smolts that have been tagged approximately 50 kilometers away in some cases. And the movement rate was very variable. I mean, you see something like 5.3 body lengths per second, and you've got to wonder if that's dictated by current or if it's in something that has wings. You never know. Route choice seems very varied for the lochy. 46% of detected fish ended up going south, and 38 went north. Contrasting that to the aw fish, it seems to be much more directed towards going down the Firth of Lorne. And the main question I have is this dictated by currents? Is it to do with the tidal phase, and is the water going one way when you enter the sea at a certain time, and is it going the other way when you enter the sea at the other time? So really, there's a need to take this further and have a look at the current modeling, because I don't think acoustic telemetry alone is going to have all the answers. So I think a much more mixed and integrated approach could be used. This is actually just an animation for Applecross, and it just shows the kind of how the currents vary in the area by month. It's crude, but quite nice to show what the shelf model can produce. We actually have current meters that are being deployed this spring in the area around Mull. So the hope is that rather than just take the pure output from the shelf model, we can actually validate it by using actual recorded current data. So there's a real hope that we can sort of get quite a robust estimate of the currents in the area. So for general study, this is really the first outputs for a 10-year program of work. These outputs are useful for future marine planning decisions. There's tying in the biological movements of smolts with the Scottish shelf model and particle tracking could, and a sort of caveat that could, lead to predictive modeling of smolt dispersal. So we could eventually end up with quite a nice tool to predict where smolts go. But in the interim, I'd say that acoustic telemetry still remains the best tool for characterizing smolt movements. And that is it, I think.